because I think it's important for us to go into that because, you know, just recently I saw something where Museveni, as a Christian, and he was apologizing for the part that Africans played in the slave trade. And, you know, and I think we need to clarify that in a significant way, because while obviously there'll always be collaborators, I mean, it wasn't simply that Africans were offering up their brothers and sisters and saying, here, you know, come and take them. No, there was obviously not just coercion, but force was used in terms of gaining enslaved people, kidnapping enslaved people. And if certain kingdoms, if you will, or chiefs did not cooperate, then they would be liquidated and removed, and their subjects would be enslaved. I think, you know, we need to go through that, Robin, in terms of, you know, information that you would have that I probably wouldn't have.
One of the areas of research that I did was inspired by the theory put forward by Professor Herny Louis Gates that Africa was primarily responsible for the slave trade. So what I had to do was, well, let's look at this. And he gave the example of Ghana, the modern country of Ghana, what used to be the Gold Coast and so on. And so what I did was I looked at what do the documents say. And the documents present a very, very different picture to the one presented by Professor Herny Louis Gates. The documents actually support the theories of Professor Chancellor Williams. Now, Williams shows that with the slave trade, you've got several things happening at the same time. You've got Europeans capturing a certain number of people and then sending them in to do slave raids. So you end up with black slave soldiers being sent in to do a slave raid. And then you've got the Europeans armed and at the back. And if any of those soldiers desert, they'll be shot. Right? You've got that process happening. Then you've got kingdoms seeing an advantage that if one kingdom has been destabilized by slavery, you can move in and capture. Then you've got the propaganda, where you've got agents will go to the king of one country and say, you better arm yourself because these people are coming for you. You've got those kinds of processes happening. And if you look at the documents that have survived, you'll find that a lot of African kingdoms, a lot of African city-states, their existence was extremely precarious. There's an account that I use, I think it's William Bosman, writing in the year 1700. He visited the Gold Coast in 1691 and then came back in 1700. And a lot of the cities he described in 1691 didn't exist in the year 1700. And then I asked my students, what do you think happened to the people of the cities that he's describing? And the answer is they're either dead or they're on slave ship. And so what you then have then is the kingdoms that end up surviving that end up having to become war machines. And the two kingdoms that became the fiercest war machines were the Ashanti Empire, and then further on along the coast, the Dahomey Empire. They became war machines. And in truth, while they did a lot of horrible things, and they did a lot of horrible things to Black people, they wouldn't be here today had they not done that, because they would have been wiped out like everybody else. Because essentially it creates a system of instability. And that instability, now, how did Black people get pulled out of Africa? We got pulled out in three ways. One was gun running to nation A and nation B and telling them that, you know, the other lot have got arms, you better protect yourself. And then people fight. And then you've got Portuguese and Dutch columns behind each group fighting. And then what then happens is the prisoners caught by A end up being sold over here. The prisoners caught by B end up being sold over here. And then when you read the account, they will tell you a ship is furnished with 500 Blacks in a period of 3 weeks. That's what it says in Bosman's account. Now, Bosman could see what was going on, But if you're one of the two ethnic groups that end up in the middle of that, you can't see that you're being played.
Mm-hmm.
The second way is straight up Europeans just raiding. And the raids, sometimes it would be Europeans doing it by themselves. Sometimes, again, they would send in slave soldiers.
Mm-hmm.
And then a third way would be African nations emptying their prisons.
Mm-hmm.
The scholars that talk about the three ways is, in fact, you probably know them, Professor Varian Shepherd and Professor Hilary McD Beckles.
Yeah.
I use their materials, teaching material, and they describe this. So about 45% of people were captured by raids, countries raiding each other. 40% was Europeans just snatching people, and 15% was people opening their prisons.
Mm-hmm.
And in one way or another, then of course, another side of the story that no one talks about is resistance.
Yeah.
People who have done the statistics say that in order to get one enslaved African onto a ship, you're going to have to kill 5,
Mm-hmm.
which means 5 times as much resistance as you've got captives. Mm-hmm. And the story of resistance, you see, one of the problems with people from Africa is because they have a very partial understanding of this. Mm-hmm. They should own the 5 people that died. They don't talk about the 5 people that died. They talk about the people that collaborated. And so what happens is a lot of people from Africa try to take credit for the slave trade because it means that they were strong. Mm-hmm. And consequently, this is why so many people in the diaspora blame Africa. And that's why you've got Herny Louis Gates blaming Africa. And that's how you end up with a lot of African Americans turning their backs on Africa, trying, we're not Africans, we're ADOS. We're not Africans, we're FBA. And it's all due to a partial understanding of what really went on. And so what happens is when a lot of African nations apologize and all the rest of it, they're ignoring the 5 times as many people that stood up and resisted and got killed to make their apologies. Yeah. It's almost like those 5, the 5 times as many people, it's almost like they've been erased from African memory. Yeah. Do you see?
Greetings. My name is Robin Walker. I'm also known as the Black History Man. I am perhaps best known for my 2006 book, When We Ruled. Based on this book, I'm launching a new online history course aimed at you, the adults. You could be a parent, you could be a teacher, a mechanic, cleaner, professionals, care workers, security guards, taxi drivers, kitchen workers, entrepreneurs, tech heads, lawyers, all of you. We want people from all over the world to be empowered by our content. We want you to gain mastery over your history and heritage. And you can do this by subscribing to our course. Click on the link to get this powerful, life-changing material.
I think that's so interesting because it misses so much of the reality of that period and so much of the damage that has been done, and of course the sort of misinformation is propaganda by the people who have written the history, and of course the people who have written the history are the people who have committed the crimes. So we get the sanitized version of everything, blaming, shall we say, the Africans primarily. Yeah. But obviously, it was a slave raiding expedition, foremost, and some collaborated, some didn't, but etc. But the point that you make in terms of 5 being killed for everyone that was captured. And then for everyone that was captured, by the time they marched them down to the coast and they put them in those castles that we have all visited, or the door of no return, etc., whether it's in Dakar or it's in Ghana, in Accra, etc., the crowding, etc. People die there, putting them on the ship, people dying on the ship, people
Yeah, yeah.
resisting jumping overboard, and then finally arriving, shall we say, in the New World. Again, you have another number of people dying off, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
So what is the true number? I think somebody named Curtin or somebody said 15 million arrived in the New World. I'm not sure of the numbers. Do you have any accurate, pseudo-accurate counts?
Professors Hilary McD Beckles and Varian Shepherd, they're saying 15 million arrived. But can you see that to say 15 million arrived, you haven't actually said anything. That hasn't said anything. What about the people that didn't arrive?
Yeah.
All right, now, Englishman Dr. Basil Davidson, in one of his books says 50 million.
50.
Yeah, 50.
Okay.
Didn't make it. Some scholars like W.E.B. Du Bois put the numbers who didn't make it at 100 million. And I've seen figures just get bigger and bigger and bigger. Yeah, a lot of people did not make it. Yeah.
I think the interesting corollaries of all of that is obviously the damage that it did to the development of Africa and African civilization, African culture.
Not just that, the damage to the memory. So, for example, as a Black Studies teacher, whenever I've shown students from Sierra Leone, for example, the Sapi ivory, they're astounded. They didn't know that their ancestors were doing that kind of stuff. You see. And then you've got the technological transfers. I think we spoke about this in an earlier class, where you've got the cotton technologies from Senegal and Gambia, because that was the place that produced the finest cotton in the 15th all the way through the 18th century world. And then you could imagine then why Black people from that part of the world would end up being targeted for cotton-based slavery. Then you've got the metallurgy. Then you've got the other technological and scientific processes. An enslaved African who was responsible for bringing the smallpox vaccine to Boston in the early 1700s, an enslaved African called Wanzimus. Loads and loads of examples like this. And then, of course, if these technologies are being brought to the West, then people in Africa are going to lose those technologies. All right, let me say something about that.
And the population that were being enslaved, that were fighting against enslavement, is a young population that you need to develop your country. It's the cream of the crop. They're not going to take, old men and old women or crippled or blind or handicapped. They're looking for the best. I mean, the rest they will reject or shoot them. So the heart of Africa was being cut out by the slave trade, certainly in terms of West Africa, Congo, and going all the way down to the south, and as you mentioned, even also going around on the East Coast. So all of that was happening, creating a tremendous havoc in terms of African development, but then transferring, as you're mentioning, technology. Certainly people who knew about agriculture and cultivation of rice, etc., apart from the technology that you mentioned. All that was being transferred to the New World and taken gratis with the labor of these 15 million people to develop the wealth of Europe and to develop the wealth of the Americas. And if this is such a crime against humanity, because it's a double crime in terms of genocide, in terms of the African continent itself, genocide in terms of what was going on in the Americas against the native population, and then a crime against humanity in terms of the enslavement of human beings over this, 300-year period that it ended up. And these have never been shall we say, owned up to or any restitution paid for it. But the damage is so severe that I think it's impossible to, how should I say, to define it in terms of any numerical sum, because it's beyond numbers and it's beyond, certainly not paper money, and certainly not gold or platinum or any of those things. It's because the human being, I mean, it's sacred, and therefore the wealth of any human being is incalculable. So where are we? How do we start talking about reparations? But I don't want to go to reparations yet, because I think it's important, for us to excavate, shall we say, a little more deeply that whole business of the enslavement of our ancestors and the transatlantic slave trade, because the cruelty, was enormous. And in terms of how we were spread, basically all over South America, certainly, Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, Colombia, Panama, Honduras, etc., Mexico coming up, North America, Canada, and the barbaric treatment, the slave codes, I mean, the dehumanization, and then how that dehumanization was justified in terms of academia, and we get back to Bernal, etc., and then how history was rewritten. Can you deal with that in terms of rewriting history and hiding, our contributions, from the beginning of history, shall we say, in terms of Nile Valley civilization? All of that, was in response, shall we say, to the horrors of the slave trade. They had to justify it by saying that we weren't human beings.
As a thank you for visiting our website, we are giving you a free copy of our exclusive 100 Black History Facts, which is in fact a taster of our course content. Make sure you leave your email address and we will send it right to you. We hope it inspires you to dig deeper into your history and heritage.
Yeah, I take a slightly different view. And this is what I'm coming with that's different.
Mm-hmm.
The era of lying about history wasn't the 19th century, the 18th or the 17th centuries. It was the 20th century.
Mm-hmm.
The time period where it became hardest to find an honest book on world history was the 20th century, not the previous centuries. There were too many people that couldn't keep their mouths shut in the 19th century. And there's too much literature that credits us in the 19th century. So when I wrote When We Ruled, what I did was I wrote a chapter called Survey of the Documents. And what I did in that chapter is I surveyed what data existed on African history. And what I found was this: you had a number of different traditions. From the 15th century through to the 19th century, you had what I called the diplomats, the envoys, and the spies. And what these people did was visit an African country and write about it. And they would write about it so that their people would know, okay, this is where the cities are, this is where the walls are, this is how many troops that they will have, this is how much opposition you could expect, this is where the trade routes are. And those documents exist, and they don't paint a picture of a primitive Africa. So you've got books like History of the Kingdom of Congo by a Portuguese gentleman called Filippo Pigafetta. And this was written in the late 1500s. And the whole point of that book was a spy's report laying out what's in Congo so that Europeans know what's what. And he gives a description of the city, Mbanza Congo. He gives a description of the central churches, yes, churches, where the palaces are, what the palaces look like, where the gates are. And he didn't know he was doing this, but he's painting a grand picture. And we have several such spy reports. There was an Afro-Arab gentleman, he may even been part European as well, called John Leo. Some people call him Leo Africanus. And he visits Songhai, he visits the city of Timbuktu, and tells us that in Timbuktu, there are numerous scholars, doctors, and clerics, all receiving good salaries from the king. He pays respect to men of learning. There is a big demand for books in manuscript imported from Barbary, North Africa. More profit is made from the book trade than any other line of business. Books. We have this account. And there are several such accounts. You've got the various Portuguese ones that I've talked about. You've even got from the 19th century. There was one that I came across. Two Europeans, one called Dixon Denham and another one called Hugh Clapperton, visited Sokoto, Sokoto's northern Nigeria, visited Kanem-Bornu, which is Chad, Niger, that kind of region, and encountered scholars. And the scholars, if you wanted to chat Greek philosophy, there were Black scholars that you could have that conversation with. And they described this. If you wanted to chat Islamic philosophy, people like Avicenna and so on, you could have that conversation. If you wanted to get a check cashed, you could have a check cashed. If you wanted to buy clothing made in Manchester in Central Africa, you could buy that. If you wanted to buy writing paper, you could buy that. If you wanted to buy pottery made in Nuremberg, Germany, you could buy that. Do you see? So you've got those sorts of sources. And then, of course, you've got what interests the Afrocentrists the most, what I call the Orientalists. So you had a book coming out in the 1780s by a Frenchman called Count Constantin de Volney. His book was called The Ruins of Meditations on the Revolutions of Empires, where he's talking about a Black, Sudanese, and Egyptian origin of civilization. Then you've got his mentor, Monsieur Charles Dupuy, did a book called On the Origins of All Religious Worship. Again, Black origins of Egyptian Sudanese civilization and how that is the parent of everything that came later. Then we get the birth of Egyptology under Jean-Francois Champollion, where he says that the ancient Egyptians are the same people as the modern day Nubians, as he calls them, the Kenas and Barabras, present inhabitants of Nubia, not present inhabitants of Egypt, present inhabitants of Nubia. Then we have the birth of Assyriology, where people are studying the Middle East under the likes of people like General Sir Henry Rawlinson. At the time, he was Colonel Sir Henry Rawlinson, where he describes them as Cushites, right? Then we have the beginnings of the study of Indian civilization. And it was originally thought that the Indian civilization was Aryan. And then when they did some more excavations, they found out that the Dravidians had a civilization before the Aryans got there. And that was like one of those whoops moments. But yet they found that data. And so in the 19th century, if you pick judiciously, you could pick information on African history. And you could have done almost the same research that I did when we ruled. Almost all of that information in an earlier form existed. Then you had, in the 19th century, the discovery of some of the Timbuktu manuscripts. And one of them was the Tariq el-Sudan, which enabled scholars to write the history of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai. And in the case of Songhai, give a really detailed history. And so consequently, the idea that in former time, they just lied about Black history, not necessarily. The lies came in the 20th century. So in other words, you could find an Egyptologist in the 19th century that would admit, yeah, the ancient Egyptians were Black, that's you. You can't find one in the 20th century to say that. And in the 21st century, you can't find, Professor Stephen Quirk maybe, Dr. Sally-Ann Ashton. That's it, you've run out. That's your list, right? And so the period of fakery was the 20th century. That was when, in other words, that's when European historiography just turned into pseudoscience.
Yeah, I see your point, and I think you're correct. in other words, there was scholarship that had the information, but
Yeah.
at the same time, the information was somewhat esoteric. It was
Correct.
confined to scholars.
Yeah.
But when information became popular, shall we say, in terms of not just the printing press, but in terms of the whole educational, public education,
20th century.
became suppressed. And I think
Yeah.
that's what you're saying about the 20th century, et cetera, et cetera. And people were not allowed to teach that particular history. And many of those books were not published any longer. There were libraries, gathering dust in the back rooms of libraries, as opposed to being reproduced and being a part of current information. Which really brings us, as you say, quite up to date with people like DeSantis in Florida, who don't think there's any such thing as African history or African American history or anything other than European history, and simply won't face reality per se. But the enormity and the destructiveness of that whole period, the 300 plus years of the kidnapping and enslavement, and then what it led to in terms of the colonization, in terms of people such as Leopold in Belgium, the 1884-1885 Berlin Conference, where people simply sat down and felt that they had a right to divide up Africa. But something, I think it goes back to, wasn't there a papal bull in 1494, I think it was, that told Leopold and Isabella and Christopher Columbus that go ahead, sail over the Atlantic Ocean. Anything you find belongs to you guys, belongs to Spain and Portugal. Africa and it's not Latin America, but the whole Americas. I mean, the Pope, the Catholic Pope, sits down and tells the Catholic world, ignoring everybody else, because the Catholic world at that time, I guess, is Southern Europe, and yet you're entitled to the world. Just go out there and grab it, basically. The mentality of the Pope representing Catholicism as a religion. Where's the Christianity in that?
You're right. And then what happened is unfortunately the Christianity that most of our ancestors got introduced to was a slave-making religion. And a lot of Black people never learned that places like Ethiopia and Eritrea and so on had indigenous forms of Christianity that goes back 1700 years. But we never got to know that. And that's the kind of thing that would happen. And then with it, the manipulated images of the Christ being used as racist propaganda, the manipulated images of Adam being used as racist propaganda, and so on and so forth. And the psychological damage that has done to our people has been incalculable.
The whole history, shall we say, of contact between Europe and Africa has been one of Africa given to Europe, both in terms of an understanding of what it means to be human, as well as an understanding of technology. And understanding of civilization. It's always been a giving. And what has always happened in terms of the reverse, whenever Europe has been strong enough to encroach at Africa, Europe has really brought violence and division and chaos into the African continent. And I think basically we've seen that has happened not only in terms of Africa, but obviously it happened in terms of the Americas. And it has happened in terms of the rest of the world over time. And now we have this European American hegemony of over the rest of the world. And now we have a population in excess of 6 billion. And I think we're getting to the stage where, you know, most of that 6 billion don't want to be dictated to by a Eurocentric perspective or a Euro-American perspective, because it's quite obvious, I think, that there are significant limitations to the system, because this system has brought us to, you know, so many catastrophes, but not the least of which is, of course, the climate catastrophe that we all have to deal with. I think as we go forward, you know, and I know that this is an area that you're versed in as well, and it's something that I like. We need to go back to both the philosophy and shall we say the religion of Africa, although I think you and I know that that's probably not the best term to talk about religion as far as Africa is concerned, because many African countries, certainly you go back to Nile Valley civilization, and there's no word for religion. It's a way of life. And civilization is the product of a way of life, and philosophy is the understanding of a way of life in terms of one's relationship to oneself, in terms of self-knowledge, as well as of the relationship of oneself to the environment, and then to God, if you will, and depending on how you want to consider the environment, whether you want to use a term like God, or you want to use a term like they know nowadays, the unified field, or you want to use the term the void or openness or akasha or whatever. There are so many different names, but that's the original thinking that came out of Africa, and I want us to go back there. Well, we need to go forward more in terms of this. But I want to set the stage so that people know that we're going to do a good job in terms of this, because it brings us to the current confrontation, which I think is a materialistic, individualistic a way of life, which is dependent on scientific materialism, which has pushed spirituality sort of out of the picture, has confined religion to the weekend, and of course, the religious empire has coalesced with that or agreed to it because they didn't want to get wiped out by the secular completely. So we have this dichotomy in terms of how do you live? You live, you know, 5 days of the week or whatever. You live, you know, trying to make as much money or material goods as possible. And then on the weekend, whether it's a Friday night or a Saturday or a Sunday, depending on your religion, you go ahead and talk to God. I mean, it's schizophrenic, you know. You've done a lot relative to African religions, and I just want to prepare our audience that they'll be in for a treat as we investigate African philosophy and as we investigate African religions, because I think we have to do that when we begin to talk about reparations, because what is it we're trying to repair? You know, I mean, we have to repair the whole system. It's not a matter of getting X number of dollars for the damage that has been caused. It's a matter of the system has to change. And we need a new system. And if we need a new system, then what is the system that we need? Has it ever been used before? Or do we have to invent something totally new? You know, I think we have precedent for systems, meaning civilizations that have arisen certainly along the Nile Valley, Kush, Nubia, etc., down to Kemet, that would instruct us if we excavate them properly.
Yeah, looking forward to that discussion, sir.
All right. Thanks so much, Robin. It's always a pleasure.